Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating, maybe even controversial document to look at today. It's not about one specific study, but it's a challenge to the whole foundation, the philosophical bedrock of modern science. We're talking about this argument that materialism itself is, well, broken.
That's right. That's the absolute core of it. We're digging into this one specific, quite dense submission. It's called Part 12, The Collapse of Materialist Epistemology. And it's part of a bigger framework, the Graviton Pressure Theory by Sharif Ali Rashada. And the claim is pretty stark. Materialism, the idea that physical stuff, matter, is the only fundamental thing, is basically, and this is the author's phrase, an exhausted scaffold, a dying paradigm.
Yeah, and what really jumped out at me is how it makes this argument. It's not coming from, say, religion or mysticism. It claims to use logic, scientific evidence, basically turning materialism's own rules back on itself. So the mission here, as I understand it, is to show how this framework, which always presented itself as being purely empirical, is now kind of propped up by logical gaps and, well, things you can't actually observe.
Exactly. We're exploring why a system that, supposedly relied only on observable facts is now being described in this paper as a philosophy masquerading as physics. It really goes after the internal contradictions, the places where the paper argues scientists have to invent these, let's say, imaginative fixes, things like unseen matter or hypothetical energies, just to keep the materialist picture from falling apart when the evidence doesn't quite fit.
Okay. So over the next few minutes, we're going to break down the 4 big weaknesses the paper points out: scientific, philosophical, and then look at the alternative it proposes, this idea of epistemic coherence. Right, let's unpack this. Let's start with maybe the biggest crack, logically speaking, that the paper identifies, the problem of emergence. This feels like the central hurdle, right? If everything is just unthinking matter, bits of physical stuff, how do you get subjectivity? How do you get awareness, experience, consciousness?
This is precisely where the paper argues materialism stops being rational inquiry and starts acting like a dogma. The framework insists matter has to explain consciousness. So theories get built after the fact to make sure that core assumption matter is primary, is never really threatened. And the usual answer you hear is emergence. The idea that, okay, you get enough complexity, enough non-conscious bits like neurons organized in the right way, and somehow, poof, consciousness just sort of emerges from it. Qualities that are totally unlike the parts themselves.
Okay, I understand emergence when we talk about, like, a flock of birds. Right. Yep. Simple rules, complex pattern. Or a hurricane from air molecules. That's a new level of organization. But the paper calls emergence a semantic shield. What's that mean here? Why a shield?
It means it's being used arguably to stop further questions rather than providing a real answer. It's like a rhetorical move. If you ask a materialist, okay, but how mechanistically does non-conscious matter create inner experience? And they reply, well, it emerges. They're not actually giving you a mechanism. They're using the word as a sort of placeholder for some unknown process that must be there, simply because their starting point is matter is all there is. The paper calls this epistemological circularity. You're basically assuming the conclusion to explain the very thing that challenges the conclusion.
Right. So we assume A, matter, produces B, consciousness, because our first assumption is that only A exists. But the actual link, the how, is just missing. That seems like a pretty fundamental vulnerability.
It absolutely is. And the paper references David Chalmers' well-known argument here. Consciousness isn't just about what the brain does, its functions. It's the something extra, the inner feeling, the subjective experience of being that brain.
The what it's like.
Exactly, the what it's like. You could map every neuron firing, every connection, and still not have explained that inner reality. So the paper lays down a challenge, really, an ultimatum for materialism to stay intellectually honest. Either show us the actual causal bridge from non-conscious stuff to conscious experience, or you have to seriously consider that maybe consciousness isn't a product of matter at all. Maybe it's fundamental, like charge or mass.
Wow. Okay, so clinging to emergence without that bridge is, from this perspective, kind of refusing to face the evidence in our own minds. And this refusal, this maybe sticking point, leads us into the second big issue the paper raises. This one's about the physical universe itself. Materialism is supposed to be all about empirical evidence, right? But what happens when, according to our current models, over 95% of the universe is made of stuff we can't actually find? Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, we're shifting from mind to matter now, or rather, lack of known matter. The document really takes aim at modern cosmology's deep reliance on what it terms ghost forces. These are, of course, dark matter and dark energy, constructs that are crucially unobserved directly, unverified. And According to the paper, they're invoked only because the physics we know, our theories of gravity, don't match up with what we see happening on cosmic scales.
Let's just pause on that number again. Over 95%. That's the figure the source uses for the theoretical mass-energy budget of the universe made up by dark matter and dark energy. It feels like we're building our entire understanding of the cosmos on, what, 5% of the ingredients?
It's a staggering percentage. And the paper's argument is that this reliance fundamentally undermines the claim to be strictly empirical. These aren't things we found. They are, as the paper puts it, mathematical injections.
Injections.
Yeah, like mathematical fixes plugged into the equations.
Yeah.
They're designed specifically to make the observations like how fast galaxies are spinning or the universe's expansion accelerating fit the existing gravitational theories, particularly general relativity. They're essentially, you could say, theoretical patches holding the standard cosmological model together.
And the source uses that really striking historical analogy, citing physicist Stacy McGaugh, comparing these forces to epicycles.
Right.
For anyone not familiar, epicycles were those little circles astronomers added onto the main orbits in the old Ptolemaic system because they knew Earth was the center, right? But the planets weren't moving quite right according to simple circles, so they added circles on circles to fix the math.
Exactly. Epicycles kept the Earth-centered model alive for centuries, patching the discrepancies without ever questioning the faulty core assumption. And this paper argues dark matter and dark energy are doing the same job today. They're kludges, fixes tacked on to preserve the current gravitational framework, the materialist cosmology, when faced with data that just doesn't align. The author puts it quite strongly. This is not the spirit of empirical science seeking truth. It is the defense mechanism of a paradigm under stress-seeking survival.
That's a heavy critique, suggesting the paradigm itself is resisting correction. Okay, so if we move from the cosmic scale down to how we organize knowledge itself, we hit the third crack the paper discusses, this idea of neglecting coherence, driven by what it calls obsessive reductionism.
Right. Reductionism, the approach of understanding things by breaking them down into their smallest possible parts. It's obviously been incredibly useful. We've learned a lot.
Sure, in medicine and engineering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the paper argues it's also led to extreme fragmentation of knowledge. Compartmentalization is almost seen as a good thing. So you end up with scientific fields that barely talk to each other or can't integrate their findings. Physics, for example, generally has nothing really to say about consciousness. Neuroscience often avoids deep questions about meaning or purpose. Cosmology calculates expansion but doesn't really deal with first causes.
We've created these knowledge silos, and maybe each silo works okay on its own terms, but they don't connect up. They don't form a coherent whole picture. The paper describes the result as mechanically robust and philosophically hollow. And then it asks this really penetrating question. What does it mean if materialism has made reality more comprehensible but less intelligible?
That difference is crucial. Comprehensible means we can take things apart, measure the pieces, we can analyze a neuron's firing rate, or track a particle. Intelligible means we grasp the relationships between those pieces, how they fit together, what the whole pattern means. The argument is materialism got really good at the first part, the precise description of isolated bits, but it sacrificed the second part. Understanding the unity, the interconnectedness, the intelligibility of the whole. We can describe the parts, but maybe we've lost the ability to explain why they form a meaningful, conscious reality.
And if you trace all these issues back, the reliance on emergence as a placeholder, the invention of ghost forces, this fragmentation of knowledge, the paper suggests they all stem from materialism's core philosophical assumption, its main defense, the ideal of pure, passive objectivity.
Exactly. There's a whole section dedicated to arguing that this ideal of the purely objective observer is itself kind of an illusion. It cleverly hides its own origins, which are in consciousness. The very starting point, matter is primary, isn't something we observe neutrally. It's an assumption, a philosophical commitment brought to the science, not derived from it. In reality, all observation, all measurement, the entire scientific process happens within and is shaped by consciousness.
And the paper argues that the biggest challenge to that detached observer idea comes from physics itself. Quantum mechanics specifically, because when you get down to the very small scales, observation doesn't seem passive at all.
No, it seems fundamentally active. We have experimental results that materialism finds really, really difficult to accommodate. Things like the measurement problem, how the act of measuring seems to collapse probabilities into definite states, the observer effect. The source mentions Wheeler and Zurich's work, suggesting that even things like expectation or intention might play a role at the quantum level. The universe, down at its roots, seems to respond to observation. It seems participatory.
So the data itself is telling us the observer isn't just looking at the system from outside. They're involved. The universe seems to unfold in a way through its interaction with awareness, which makes it really hard to maintain that mind is just some accidental byproduct of matter.
Yeah.
If the physics shows mind is somehow tangled up in how reality even takes shape.
Precisely. That traditional gold standard of pure objectivity kind of breaks down when the system you're studying seems to require your participation to even be in a definite state. And if that's true, the paper argues, then the whole materialist epistemology, the theory of knowledge built only on matter, is built on shaky ground. It's fundamentally unstable.
Okay, so if materialism is this exhausted scaffold, as the paper calls it, what do we replace it with? What's the alternative standard? It introduces this idea of integrative coherence. So what does this all mean? For scientists, for anyone just trying to figure things out?
It suggests a pretty radical shift in focus. Instead of prioritizing breaking things down empirical fragmentation, the goal should become seeking harmony, synthesis, integration. The paper defines coherence not just as, do the facts within this little box agree, but as something much bigger, the resonant harmony of structure across all levels of reality. A good theory shouldn't just survive testing within its own narrow field. It needs to survive integration with everything else we know: physics, biology, consciousness, maybe even meaning and purpose.
So this new standard, coherence, it demands more. A truly comprehensive model would have to actually account for everything. It needs to handle mind, causality, maybe even intention, while also lining up with physics, with biology, connecting metaphysics and mind into one consistent picture.
That's the ambition, yes. It pushes beyond just, does it predict things accurately, which is materialism's main claim to fame. It aims for a deeper alignment with reality, as we actually experience it and observe it in its totality. It values structural integrity and logical consistency across all domains, not just within isolated ones.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive has laid out a pretty compelling case, from this one source at least, that materialism might be buckling under its own weight. Its key explanations, emergence for mind, randomness for order, reductionism for truth, the paper argues they've failed to account for the structure, the apparent intention, and especially the coherence we seem to find in the universe.
And the paper finishes with something called an invitation to the honest scientist, which is really a call for intellectual bravery. It basically says, defending the current consensus isn't the point of science. Science should be the relentless pursuit of coherence no matter where it leads, even if it leads away from comfortable assumptions.
Which definitely leaves us, and maybe you listening, with a final provocative thought pulled straight from this material. What would it genuinely take for you to reconsider your own fundamental assumptions about reality? The paper essentially asks, if the evidence from physics itself seemed to point towards consciousness or maybe even intention being fundamental, would you follow that trail? Or would the fear of sounding unscientific or associating with ideas previously dismissed like spirituality or metaphysics stop you from exploring where the evidence seems to point? Something to think about.